All right, so this is the right time. Let's start, and I think we have a core number of participants over 50 now, and we are expecting over 100. So welcome to this session, CUI over coffee. I would say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you who are depending on where you are having coffee. My name is Praful Sharma, CTO of Corrosion Radar, and your host today and moderator of this panel session. CUI over coffee. So it's a series of regular online discussions within our CUI community, corrosion under insulation, a big issue. And this is about sharing observations and thoughts and thought leadership around a big asset integrity issue, which is corrosion under insulation and how people are managing it, what is the past, present, and the future. So we have over 100 expected participants today on this session across 50 different companies, multiple countries around the world, multiple time zones, which is fantastic. And I'm looking forward to have a good discussion with the experts here on the panel. First of all, I hope all are safe and well. These are interesting times, testing the human race, and all of us needs to be safe at this moment. On our panel today, we have Rebecca Allison from the Oil and Gas Technology Center, who is joining us from Aberdeen. And we have Femke de Jager from Accenture, Managing Director of Industry X.0 initiatives. So great to have you both here. It's great to have in this session. So I would like to spend about next 30 minutes on coffee. I think that will be about the coffee time, and then we will take question and answers on this issue of I'm sure a number of people have this on their minds about, are we doing enough to manage CUI effectively? So just a couple of points, just a house rules, that the webinar will be recorded and made available to all the registrants. There is a Q&A, question and answer option available at the bottom of this webinar, where you can post questions. This is to all the participants today. You can post the questions, and at the end of our panel discussion, for the last 25 minutes or so, we will try to answer as many questions among the panel. There's always this email ID called webinars@corrosionradar.com, in which you can send your questions after the webinar, if at all, and the panel can answer that even offline. Also, I would like to mention that, for smooth running of this webinar session, if you can mute your microphone, that will be easy for us to handle this webinar. So let's start. Has everyone got their coffee, hot drink, or masala tea, as we call in India, and lift your coffee cup to start the corrosion CUI over coffee? So I will quickly share my perspective to start with. So some of us know we are experts on asset integrity issues. So corrosion is among the biggest industry problem. Arguably, it's the biggest problem, costing the world trillions of dollars every year. Among that is corrosion under insulation, which is a major industry issue. And there have been so many aspects to it. I mean, it's technical problems, guidelines, managerial, so on and so forth. So for some of us, I will spend a minute for the younger participants and people who are just getting familiar with this industry. The definition of corrosion under insulation is something, a corrosion which is happening on the outside surface of pipes or assets or equipments which are hidden under the insulation. And because of this hidden nature, water can seep in, it starts to degrade, and it can go unnoticed. And it has led to a lot of shutdowns, and I'm sure panels will have, panel guest members have a lot of experience on that. And this is arguably the number one or main issue, which is bothering the oil and gas, petrochemicals, and heavy industries. And that's why we are still talking about it. So are we doing enough? That's the question for today. And why do you care? So I will start this question of the past, and then we'll get into present and the future in the next 30 minutes. So let me start with this one quick overview, open question. So Rebecca, to you, will you please spend a few sentences on about yourself, your experiences, and why do you care about CUI, and what is your observation as an opening statement?
So, hello everybody, and just to introduce myself, I'm the Asset Integrity Solution Centre Manager at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre based in Aberdeen. So we are a funding organisation specifically looking at challenges within the oil and gas industry, but we all know corrosion under insulation is not just an oil and gas problem, it's in any industry that has process pipework and vessels. So we are tasked with looking at how we can solve the problem from an industry perspective and help working with the development community. My background, I have been an integrity engineer for a long time, over 20 years. I know I don't look it because I am very young, so I started very early. However, one of the things that I always go back to is I, as a young graduate engineer, standing on the Fulmar Alpha, which is still going strong. I think it's over 50 years old now. I think it was in around about the 1970s it was put in the North Sea. And standing there in 1996, so over 20 years ago, and working with a fabric maintenance company, and we were having a discussion because we were stripping off some cladding, looking for CUI and saying, how can we solve this problem? Fast forward 20 odd years, we are still doing the same problem, or still trying to solve the same problem, and we manage it the same way. We strip it off, we have a look, we try and find it. Half the time we don't find it, then it finds us before we actually get to it, and we have significant failures in our industry from a safety and obviously environment and business reputation point of view. So in my experience of the 20 years I've been working with in the integrity sector, we haven't seemed to have moved forward with this problem. Why do I care about it? Because right now we can stop it if we want. There are procedures, there are technologies, there's process. Everything is in place to stop this, and we choose not to. And that's what I really want to start discussing and delving into. What can we do to actually put a lot of the tools that we have in place? Yes, there are gaps. Yes, there's things we can do. But how do we start as an organisation and as a community to actually put best practice in place? So that's where I'm coming from and why I care about it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. I mean, the punchline, you mentioned it. And it's a very famous statement Rebecca mentioned. CUI finds us before we find it, right? So that's a good statement. Thank you, Rebecca. And Femke, over to you for a few sentences about yourself and how do you see CUI as an industry problem?
Yes, thank you so much. And from Aberdeen over to Amsterdam, and then we go back to you. Happy to join this conversation. So thank you very much for the invitation to join this conversation. Actually, it's lunchtime for me, so not so much the coffee. Within Accenture, I lead the practice what we call Industry X.0, which is actually the crossroad between core operations and digital transformation, which means that we help clients, and for me it's predominantly in oil and gas and chemicals across Europe, to on the one hand set the foundation around asset management, but for example also around risk-based inspection programs, where you also need asset data and tooling in place. But then in order to progress and advance, the whole innovation angle comes in. And that's actually where we work with an ecosystem of partners and also innovative companies. And very pleased to have Corrosion Radar in our ecosystem, because we do know that one of the parties also being able to make the difference for our clients. Well, and why I care? Because it is such an important topic for our clients, definitely from a safety and LOPC perspective, but even also from a cost perspective. And what I typically see clients struggling with, an uncertainty of the lines and risks. So currently a lot of inspection work is still done reactive. It is done based on perceived risk, and that means, for example, corrosion on the insulation can be easily missed, or on the other side, equipment being over-inspected. We also see sometimes, and your question was, is companies doing enough? Well, actually, sometimes they do too much. because they don't have a proper program in place, and then you see large scopes and actually too high frequency of inspections. And also the way inspection is often very cost intense, especially if you have to work with scaffolding. And finally, a lot of the inspection work also brings safety risk to people, especially if you have to inspect at height or in confined spaces. So numerous of the elements that we see clients struggling with in the broader sense. It's not only corrosion under insulation, but corrosion management in general. And what we do see, of course, because you are in a high-risk situation, good work around understanding damage mechanisms, etc. But what we see in a lot of cases very much from a more expert view, and not so much yet about a data view. And if you really can get your hands around data, proper data analytics, we believe that really a step change is possible. But that's the forward look to the future.
Great, thank you, Femke. I mean, you mentioned a few interesting points that CUI have been a widespread global issue, and that's why we are talking about it today. In fact, you also touched upon, thank you for that, that it's not only a problem of technical problem, but also there are various issues around access, scaffolding, cost associated to those. In fact, now what you mentioned is, as of now, people are doing expert knowledge-based systems, and then you want to talk about more data-driven techniques. So we'll come to that in a later half of this panel discussions. So thank you for your session, for your answers. So that brings me to the first question of today. As to Rebecca, you mentioned about we have the tools, but we have the tools. We are not using all the tools. If you want to stop CUI, we can stop it today, right? So let's start from the basics. So in the past, you have over 2 decades of experience hands-on in the North Sea, offshore. So your perspective very important. So in the past, right from when you're talking about 1996, when you were observing that pipe, which was heavily CUI affected, and so far in the last 2 decades, what have you observed? What happened in the past? How it was managed in the past, and then later on we'll come to the present, but I would like to get perspective of the past. So Rebecca, over to you.
So certainly over the last 2 decades, again, there's always been, we will do risk-based activities, so we'll try and predict where we think it's going to occur, so we use our different RBI techniques. Not always to 580, 581. It's not applicable standard usually in the UK upstream market for various reasons. It's quite difficult to implement. It's seen as a costly exercise, and half the time we don't have the information to populate it. So we will do some sort of risk-based inspection. I think Femke also touched on that. How effective is that? We don't always have great confidence in that, so we do a lot of engineering judgment. So that has been a part of the legacy in the past of using some of the RBI systems. We, again, in my experience, we have done a lot of strip and search, then replace like for like. So we haven't really gone through the alternative materials, alternative coating. I know there's a question come up on the chat saying, everything starts from good coatings. So yes, do we really understand and invest in the coating side? I think there's been always a great challenge on the budgets. It's not seen as a huge priority sometimes for people that are not in the inspection and integrity space. I mean, but sometimes when you start looking at it, again, back to why do we care and why is this so important and why we do need to look at the present and then the future. A couple of examples, we've had some real high profile cases recently in the North Sea where one operator was fined 1.15 million for a CUI failure. So that was a fine, but they reckon it may have cost them £10 million just on the shutdown and the associated costs of the HSE investigation, the legal piece, and also the reputational bit. We had another one quite significantly, again, with another operator who had to shut down for 28 days because they had a significant failure or near failure on their oil export line. And again, they're estimating that to be around about £268 million worth of lost revenues due to the shutdown, etc., and some of the costs associated with that. So I think in the past we haven't really given it the priority and the focus that if we don't do something, the costs can be huge, because half the time when we do go and do the inspection, we don't find anything. So it does sometimes come across as a challenge to people to say, actually, we're over inspecting, we don't really know what we're, how we're handling this properly. So I think that really needs to be looked at as well, from how do we move forward for the future.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I mean, thanks, Rebecca. You actually mentioned quite a lot of important points in the CUI experience in the past, that people have made API 581 and equivalent guidelines for RBI. So RBI is one optimization method of inspections. You mentioned it's not, not a lot of people are following it in the UKCS because of applications, and I'll come to that shortly. So RBI is one method. There's a lot to be done on the RBI side. It's not foolproof. That's what you mean. Also, you mentioned about coatings, and coatings, there have been so much of drive behind development of coatings. There's no foolproof method of the coatings as well. And that's another parallel track which is under development. From the past, it's not yet there. And actually, one of the interesting points you mentioned is about budgets, because that's other than technical. We can tackle a lot of engineering and technical problems. We have the tools which we can solve right now. But the way management looks at CUI as an issue, or asset integrity as an issue, and allocates the budget to these particular specific issues, it needs to be seen in a different light. And that's what you mentioned about. And another interesting point is over inspection. And when CUI is not there and you inspect it and you don't find anything, that's kind of a wasted exercise, spending money and cost in the process. So thank you for that. And the key summary of this is a CUI should be seen as a system issue. I think there are multiple moving parts of it, not only RBI, not only coatings, not only budgets, and not only efficiencies, but overall systems. And I can see some of the audience started to comment on it. And one of them is, I see Gino from Borealis have been mentioning that CUI should be mitigated from day one, and it should be incorporated in the project design. And that's a difficult question as to how a designer can incorporate something which will happen after 5 or 10 years, right? And how do they get buy-in? So I will actually ask this question to Femke, because Femke comes from design consultancy and that background. So Femke, do you think CUI is such a massive issue, and it has become a big issue, but why is it not often tackled in the design stage? Because as Rebecca said, we have all the tools available technically, but the problem lies somewhere else. Why is it not tackled at the design stage? Over to you, Femke.
Yeah, if I take that point, I would take not working from a total cost of ownership perspective. And I think it touches upon what Rebecca already said, is that you do have to understand the decisions that you take early in your asset life cycle will have an impact on how you operate and maintain and inspect later on. And many of the companies are typically siloed. So in the early stage capital project, they look with the CapEx focus, but then forgetting about what it will impact down the line of the asset life cycle. So I would say it is a lot about not having a total cost of ownership perspective.
Right. So thank you. You mentioned that there are early on in the design phase, people work in silos. The design teams are not necessarily thinking about the operational and maintenance. And also there's a CapEx focus in the design stage and the construction stage, which not necessarily taken into maintenance into account. So one of the outcomes of this discussion is that at the design stage, we should have maintenance in mind, longer term in mind, and for these kind of CUI issues to happen. Now, this brings me to the second question of this discussion. Again, I'll pass the ball to Rebecca. That we have talked about the past, and there have been so many developments. etc. in the past. And in the present, let's come to the present. What is the current state of affairs? Are we still talking about what we observed 20 years back? Or are there some interesting developments? And then we'll come to the future. But let's talk about the present affairs. What have we learned from last few decades to where we are right now? Both in terms of system issues as well as especially around measurement and inspection challenges. Rebecca.
Okay, so we are, because we're so closely aligned with industry and the development community, we do see that people are now reevaluating what can and should be done. And we have resurrected, we're part of the CUI network with the Energy Institute. That's now come back to life to discuss this in more detail. We are working with the Asset Integrity Task Force Group, which is a part of the Oil and Gas Authority's Asset Stewardship Board. So again, this has now been raised as a priority within the operating community. So we are seeing that bit of a shift on, there is more focus on it and hopefully more budget to try and look at this. I think there's also realization that this is not just an inspection problem or just a coating problem, and a lot of the work that we've done within the OGTC is very much around the awareness of the 4 elements that need to be looked at together, as well as the human factors piece. So we are looking at the whole risk-based detection side. So where can we use data analytics, machine learning, and all the digitalization technologies that are now available or are now starting to emerge into the market to help predict better. You then tie that into then the sensor type technology that again is now being looked at from retrofit for brownfield sites, that are low cost, ATEX compliant, and all the various challenges associated with retrofitting sensors onto large scale plants. But that also, you can see that into the new facilities coming through as well. How do you use sensor Internet of Things type technology there? And then we start looking at the inspection techniques. We have some existing techniques that are being in the industry for a little while. We're now having better awareness. There's been a lot of work done with the hoist GIP, looking at pulsed eddy current to some of the ultrasonic and some of the newer technologies that come along. We can talk about those in the sort of future developments, but we are working on a number of technologies as well that from an inspection and screening point of view will help narrow down the inspection efforts. And then the last one is around the whole repair and mitigation. So looking at alternative insulation systems, we are moving away from the traditional cladding to the more organic, aerogels, the new coating systems, and some of those are starting to emerge. So there is a better appetite for putting new and different types of technology and options on board. And there's also this awareness from the human factors of the motivation, the budget control, the long-term effect of deferring maintenance and from that point of view, and risk awareness, risk management. So we are seeing a shift in that, and that's obviously helping towards one of our goals that we've put out there as the OGTC and the Asset Integrity Solutions Centre, is to eliminate CUI by 2026. So I've got 6 years to try and solve this problem, and you know something? I think we can do it, because I think there's some exciting technologies, and we can touch on them in your next sort of question. But certainly from existing technologies that are out there, or whether it's inspection techniques to coating systems to the RBI type systems, there are some exciting things that are being adopted and trialed right now. So it's all looking positive.
Great. I mean, thanks for the answer, Rebecca. You mentioned about there's so many developments around which you are overseeing. Of course, I'll touch upon what OGTC is trying to do. How their vision is, because you talked about there's a digital side of things. Can the CUI be tackled from a digital data side of things, sensor side of things? Can it be tackled from RBI perspective? But a whole lot of different thought processes around screening altogether. Can we separate the problem of CUI detection into not only inspection but screening as a first step? And also you talked about there are different insulation systems, because one of the observations I personally have is now the industry is realizing that people are working, as Femke also mentioned, it's in silos. The inspection department have worked separately than the maintenance departments, and they have worked separately from designers. EPC project engineering teams, but now we are seeing that they are talking to each other. And one of the examples is that if CUI can be looked at from a systems perspective as to what really should happen, because everything is contributing to CUI. So even installations are contributing to CUI, because installations are supposed to protect it, but they are contributing to CUI. Coatings have their own trajectory of life cycle, and they are getting affected, but they are part of the puzzle as well. So I see a lot of initiatives from OGTC on various aspects of CUI. Can you please touch upon that and give examples, specific examples of how different aspects are being tackled? One example each, probably. Hey, Rebecca, over to you.
Okay, so if we look from the RBI sort of data analytics, it's one of the areas that we're still exploring. We are looking at it more from plant-wide. It's maybe not so specific. Some of our projects that we're working on CUI specifically, but we are looking at, or we have some projects that are looking at the data analytics and using legacy data. One of the challenges we have within the industry is data sets. Getting hold of all the legacy, especially if you're looking at AI machine learning. The more data we have, the more we can teach and help those algorithms to have better detection rates. And it's something we're in discussion with some companies at the moment that I can't go into because it's the early stages. But we are aware of companies working in this space, and it is very much moving away from the traditional RBI techniques and looking more at the data analytics and really trending and understanding some of the cumulative risks associated with process plant and the overall risk profile and where you should be intervening and where you shouldn't be. If I touch onto the sensor piece, we do have a number of companies that are in the near mature market of ready to do deployment. Obviously, Corrosion Radar is one of them that we're supporting with your sensor technology, which is on site and doing some trials, waiting on the feedback for that to see how that performs. We also have a project with Inspection Technologies looking at electro impedance. So again, using long range type technology sensors to try and see if we can pick up the corrosion, or some of them are looking at moisture detection as well. Again, all of these technologies are in sort of field trial or trial status. All the results we will receive from these trials will be in the public domain. They will be shared to see how they've performed. I know there's been a couple of questions coming up around about a large scale deployment of these sensors. I do think a lot of these will be targeted due to the challenge of retrofit, due to the challenge of costs, especially on late life assets. So once you've identified through your RBI or your risk profiling, because we want to try and eliminate the use of the terminology RBI in the traditional sense, but once you've identified high risk areas, you would use your screening technologies. We do have some other projects, one with the DND looking at sensors for detection of moisture and corrosion using the cladding. So again, maybe more for the downstream market that still use the traditional metallic cladding systems, and using that to help the electrical impedance circuits. So again, that's maybe slightly limited on the upstream side of things. We also have a project with Subterra as well that's looking at some imaging using handheld millimeter scanning technology. So there are lots of different technologies, and if anybody's interested in those, I mean, I could go on for quite a few. I don't want to labour the point. All of the projects that we have are available for public consumption, so if anybody's interested in them, they can contact us or go into our website for more information.
And how about the insulation side?
From the insulation, again, it's been quite a limited. We are seeing some of the aerogels coming through. The acceptance of aerogels has been slightly not as accepted in the industry as we would like. Again, it's about field trialing and demonstrating that opportunity to see how those perform. So it's something we're interested. One of the big things I have said for a little time now is, why has nobody developed see-through insulation?
Right. I mean,
you can see through it. If you can see through it.
Well, I know one of the initiatives which have been by many of the operators that if you don't need an insulation, don't put the insulation. And that's equivalent of see-through insulation, isn't it? That you don't need
Yeah.
it effectively.
And
So
and there
plays
has
around.
been some challenge with, you know, and that's where working with the process teams and the maintenance teams to really understand, do you need, I know some operators have moved the budgets from going from saying, well, the inspection team won't have the budget, the process or the maintenance guys will have the budget, and then that opens a different conversation about, well, do you really need it? So there are lots of people are doing stripping and not replacing, so that is again an alternative. Don't put it back on.
So great. I mean, to summarize your point, you know, I noted it down that you don't like RBI as a word. You say, okay, inspect high risk areas. For that, you need to find high risk locations. And you mentioned, Rebecca, about several sensor technologies are coming in. So I definitely see a trend currently of moving away from traditional inspections, because traditional inspections have been designed for something else, not necessarily for CUI, but traditional inspection comes at a verification stage of CUI, but we do need screening techniques like sensors. And as you mentioned, there are so many industry movement towards sensors, both for corrosion as well as for moisture. And that's an interesting trend that brings us to the point where people are not necessarily looking at direct corrosion or wall loss. People are also looking at what leads to that wall loss, which is moisture, salt content, etc. And there have been so many sensors around it. So I'll actually pass the ball to Femke about this same question about current trends as to what she observes from the global market perspective as to how your end users and customers are having experiences around what is available so far. And then I'll come about in the what happens in the future, what should happen in the future. So Femke, how do you see your customers responding currently to the CUI? Do they focus more on the insulations or the coatings or inspections or sensors or all of them?
Well, I'll take it one step broader first. What we typically see is now, with the whole digitization, is especially the more physical types of digital technologies are tried out. For example, drones, you can use drones to do inspection, especially also, for example, for flares or in confined spaces, and it brings you a lot of benefit from a safety and a cost perspective. So the companies we work with, they're engineered-oriented companies, and the boys, they like their toys. And so this kind of technologies like the drones is really embraced. But then the next thing is, even if you use drones, you can work with image recognition and have it with the whole new also compute power, etc. That is where the interesting fact starts kicking in. That you can really start on machine learning, also on your images, etc., and taking data from different sources, where you also can work on prediction of corrosion under insulation. So it becomes also more a data analytics piece, which is more difficult, I would say, because it is more conceptual. It is hard work because lots of the data are not available, so you have to get your head around how to get actually the right data available. And so you need to look at it much from a transformational perspective. And that's one of the advices I would give to the audience, especially if you start working with advanced analytics. Really focus first on like white box modeling, because if you go to black box modeling directly, and this is what we experience with some of our clients, it is very, very difficult to win the trust. So even if you start working with advanced analytics to also predict your corrosion on the insulation, whatever technology generates the data, but really build the trust about that actually these models do work. And then there's another element coming into play, because except for the companies themselves who need to start working on that, because they can leverage the data and become much more effective and efficient around their corrosion, is that also the authorities, the authorities who come to inspect at the asset owners, they also need to have that new way of thinking and looking at new concepts and new ways of working. Because if they don't go into that same digital transformation as our clients are going to, you will have a disconnect between how the clients are going to work, the oil and gas companies are going to work, versus the way the authorities look at them. So I would bring that also in, because it's an important element in the whole topic around corrosion.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Femke. I mean, you touched upon this point about we need to use more data. We need to use more models. There have been so many developments around more models to have a more predictive approach to CUI. And one of the key aspects is the trust. Now, will the industry trust it enough, those models and the data? So one of the points I liked about what you mentioned is there has to be joint efforts from not only from the researchers working in the industry, in the universities, but also, to build that trust around models for the industry themselves to build that those models or be a part of that developmental exercise, so that their data is being used for building the models. They can trust their own data and their own researchers. So I think trust is the key word if we want to go into data. So that brings me to the next aspects of how do we see the future. And Femke, this actually I'll start with you on this. You mentioned about that we need to use more data and we need to use trusted models. What is the barrier, and how do you see we overcoming this barrier in the future? And how do you see the future of CUI management in general, be it from data-driven perspective or predictive modeling perspective? Or do you see more sensors coming in, or online monitoring aspects coming in? So there are various angles to this. I will let you choose which angle you want to tackle, and how do you see the future in the next few years?
Yeah, it is one of the good things that with new technologies coming in, and also, for example, the proposition of corrosion radar, you actually will get more data available. That's the good thing. And also with the enormous developments, around big data analytics, etc., and algorithms, making use of that will the combination of the data and the algorithms, they will start bringing you more predictive insight. But then if you think about it, if you really want to make the step change, you have to take it from a transformation perspective, because also, for example, capabilities and skills of people will need to change. If people and inspectors and operators have been used to a certain way of working, even though you have new sensors, and you have new data, and you have more forward look insight, that does not necessarily change the way they work. So therefore, a more holistic approach is required. Yes, technology is developing, and that's great, and we will have more data available. But to really make the step change, really think about it from your operating model, your processes, your underlying tools. What kind of software are you actually going to use to get to that predictive insight? So it's a much more holistic view that you actually need.
Great. And Femke, do you want to touch upon any specific initiatives Accenture and similar companies in the industry are taking to have that data-driven and algorithm-driven approach and holistic approach to CUI?
Not sure I fully get your question, but typically what you see, unfortunately, in most of the cases, it starts with a certain incident, which either an LRPC or a really high-risk situation. So there needs to be a kind of a trigger, and unfortunately, in many cases, it's like a negative trigger. And then at a certain point in time, we have worked with an oil and gas company in Australia, and then top management said, hey, but this situation happened. Could we actually have known about it? And the answer was yes. And that was then the moment of really start thinking about, okay, but the data that we have already, can we start thinking and modeling? And, and then you get this ball rolling down the hill, I would say.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. It's as you mentioned, it's more reactive at the moment. Something happens, then it's a negative trigger, and people start to think. So Rebecca, what do you think about the future? How the future should be, and what is the likely future in the next 5 to 10 years? I know you don't want any CUI by 2026. So how do you see it, and how will you achieve it?
So there's always two sort of points to this question. There's what does the future look like, and what's achievable in the future? Because if you actually wanted to start with what should the future look like, or what we want the future to look like, we again as an industry are investing quite heavily in automation, so from the robotic side. So if you could actually have dynamic risk assessments So you're always constantly aware of where your risks are. It's changing as your process changes, as your environmental conditions, so all those little failure mechanisms and degradation models that we have, you know, are constantly being updated with our data analytics companies and all the technology that's out there that I have, to be quite frank, have no idea how any of that works, but you know, that's the data scientists and computer scientists of the world that can do that piece. If we had that with then some really smart prognostic sort of sensor technology that does, you know, that monitors, not bringing lots and lots of data back, because again, we do see this, we have more and more data, we just get flooded with it, but it doesn't mean anything. So actually having proper sensor technology that will start raising awareness early so you can intervene. You then have your robotics community, whether it's the drones to the land-based robots going around doing the inspection with the different techniques that are coming through, you know, whether it's through some of the more novel techniques that are being developed right now, or even some of the older ones, you know, the pulsed eddy currents of the world that have been around for a little, but are slow, but if you use a robot to do it, it doesn't matter if it takes a bit longer. And then you have some new coatings that are really robust that can also be put in place by the robots of the world. That would be the ideal scenario. Realistically, that's not going to be 5-10 years, but I think everything we do has to aim towards that. So the next 5-10 years has to start enabling that. So if you have the sensors, you have the alternative systems, you have the data analytics, when we do have more automation in the system, then they will be able to pick those up. So that's the way we see it going. There are companies working in that space. Some of the large oil and gas operators are very much looking at robotics, and some of the work they're doing is for that long-term maintenance of aging infrastructure. So I do think it's an exciting time ahead for the development community. This is a real opportunity for engineers to really just say, what could we do different? Rather than trying to do what we've traditionally done. And again, I think some of the commentaries come back to, we always revert back to our old ways. I think we should be brave. I would like to see us as a community. We are engineers, we are experts, we love solution engineering. So come on, let's get together as a community and actually say, this is how we want to do it different. And you know, we have a number of operators that we work with who are quite willing to open up their plants. Usually they're onshore plants because it's easier for access and it's easier, you know, to do the field trials. But a lot of them are standing there saying, you bring us some technology, we will trial it. So that's
yeah, that's a good perspective. That, you know, it's a system issue, as you rightly mentioned. The future of Rebecca, future of CUI is holistically an ideal solution where there's an ideal coating, there's an ideal robot which does the inspection, there's ideal sensor monitoring technology, and ideal type of insulation. And we are getting there slowly but steadily. And what is good to see that, you know, we need to take bold steps. You know, as engineers, you have posed a question to innovators, and you know, I'm one of them, to address the industry in my own way. But you did mention that the oil industry and operators have realized this as a big issue, and they are spending and they are ready to take a bold steps, and you are leading that initiatives. So thanks for that. And I think we are on the tail end of our panel discussion before we take on question answers. So just a closing remarks, 1 or 2 sentences of what we see and what we see in the future, what is happening. So I'll start with Femke and then Rebecca. So Femke, how do you see the summary of this as a closing remark? What takeaway you want to give us?
Well, I have to do it in a positive way and also express my belief in what's going to happen. Otherwise, I better close the door and do something else. But with the new technology coming up, but also still from an organizational perspective, we do know the challenges that even if you have more predictive insights, you will need to be able to respond to that. So also work processes, etc., will need to get much more agile and adaptive. But I have the belief, because there's also so much money at the table, so much potential to, you know, better scope your turnarounds, had much more money at the table, a safety improvement perspective. So I have the belief that we still can move the needle, also leveraging new technologies.
Thank you, Femke. So predictive insights of the future, That's what is needed. Learn from the past, predict from the future. Rebecca, one thing, what is it? What would you like to have if you are asked about one thing out of this?
So I suppose from our perspective, and we're maybe in a very fortunate position because we do see lots of cool stuff. We do get work with the industry who are very supportive of what we're trying to do. I think I would like to reach out to the innovators out there to say, come on guys, be brave. Put your engineering hat on. And you know something, there are funding opportunities out there for those that want to just maybe push the boundary a bit. And
Okay.
we're here to help. So.
Great. So thanks, Rebecca. You mentioned about bold steps. You are looking for bold engineers, innovative engineers to solve these issues around CUI from multiple perspectives. And I think good to see operators being supportive of that, oil industries being supportive of that. So that brings me to the question answer session. And thank you to the panelists for sharing your views. Now we'll all take questions. I will read the questions. There are some good questions coming in. There's one question coming in from Malaysia, and that's addressed to Femke and actually all of us. How much inspection do you see? Any rough estimate? How much over inspection do you see? Any rough estimates? Femke, what's your experience on the over inspection part? I think by this means, what they mean is when CUI inspection is happening, when it is not supposed to happen. So do you see those cases?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to put an exact figure on it, but it is that effect of over-inspecting, it is not only over-inspecting, but also, for example, what do you do, that's the more the internal corrosion aspect, or for example, corrosion inhibitors. So doing too much, that actually pops up in multiple forms, but actually I find it difficult to put a number on it right now.
Right, so it's difficult to estimate, but we definitely see over inspection as a problem. Okay, so let's take another question. I think there are so many questions, I have to pick and choose. Sorry to the audience to be not being, picking all of them. But so this is a question coming from Netherlands because I see Geert Henk coming from Netherlands. So the question is, do you see the effectiveness of the entity methods being available right now and used as a means to reduce the risk according to specific deterioration mechanisms? For example, wall deterioration or under support. So that's the question. So I think the question is, what is the effectiveness of the current NDT methods and where they are effective or not? So Rebecca, any clues on that?
So there are certain techniques that are better than others for the different failure modes and degradation mechanisms. There has been a lot of work that has been done with hoists. That's a GIP group in the UK that is sponsored by industry as well as service providers and developers. So we have a number of projects that we're working with them with the OGCC, so there is some information available on some of the techniques that have been used and their effectiveness. There's always going to be a limitation on every technique. Not one technique is going to solve every single challenge. That's where we are interested in filling those gaps. So the more we understand what gaps are still there, that's when we know we have to go and develop more technology to fill those gaps. So I think I don't think it's an easy one to answer in a concise sort of question here. Is a case of there is lots of information out there that we're trying to pull that together into a more concise place or one area to show what's effective and what's not, what isn't. It also comes down to potentially the service provider as well and their competency of applying those techniques. There is a mix of challenges associated with that, to the individual NDT technician, to the actual company and the technology they're trying to deploy. So there are some training issues there as well. So it's a complex piece on that one. But the more awareness we have, the more we raise that, the wider the community will understand what's the most effective techniques for the different scenarios that you're looking at.
Great. So I think HOIS and all those initiatives, and in fact OGTC initiatives, are also interesting that way, that they are providing the community with evidence that these techniques are useful and these techniques are having challenges. So that's the next question coming from Nigeria. Actually, the Nigeria, the oil and gas industry have multitudes of corrosion challenges. I'm interested to know, how can I know more about your initiatives? So this is a question from Nigeria asking, how can he or she access the information on what is the latest projects or initiatives from OGTC or from Accenture? So Fremke, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Rebecca. So how can people know more about the initiatives you are taking in Accenture, Femka? Are there portals, web portals, or emails?
Yes, definitely. And the most easy one is to go out to Accenture.com, where you have certain insights sites on a specific topic or on a specific industry. So that's the most easy access, but also we are active on social media, and so you can also find specific topics of interest over there. And then as the third one, we join also several types of communities, and actually I would imagine that most of the participants today, we find ourselves in the same kind of networks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think CUI over coffee is one such avenue to have dissemination
Yes.
of new ideas and thoughts. Any conferences you suggest, Femke, for these kind of issues where people can learn more about these issues?
Oh, let me think about it for a moment. I'll get back to you.
All right, I'll come to you again. So Rebecca, how can people access information about OGTC projects and the developments?
So all of our projects that we are supporting, the ones that are either in flight or the ones that have been completed and are under case studies, will be on our website, logtc.com. So everything is there. It's very high level because we could go into lots of technical detail, but we are mindful not all audiences want technical details. So if there's any projects that are of interest, then obviously we can share more information on those to anybody that's interested. So that's from the OGTC point of view. But there are others in this space. DNV have been doing a lot of webinars on CUI because they have some recommended practice that has been issued. And the Energy Institute also have a lot of work being done in this area as well with Dr. Cameron Stewart. There's also, let's say, the Hoist. They do have some public documentation on some of the inspection work they've been doing. So there's a large number of different avenues out there. One of the things that we are looking at as an OGTC perspective as an industry is potentially pulling all that together into one place, something that we're looking at from a white paper, technical paper point of view, but that will be later on this year, maybe into next year. It's something we're looking at, but certainly there is, I don't mind pointing people in the direction of specific areas that they're wanting to look into. You've also got things like the ICOR community, and also the EMUA. So there's lots of different industries looking into this, so you just need to have a bit of a dig around Google for the moment. But yeah, pulling it into one place would be a useful thing, and it's something that we are hoping to address as an industry at the moment.
So I would say some of the few keywords you mentioned about not only OGTC website, the projects are listed there, and then there are time-to-time publications around it. But also you mentioned about various initiatives from Institute of Corrosion, ICOR. You also mentioned about EMUA, Hoist. That's another keyword which is doing a lot of CUI work. And that brings me to the next question, because that's coming again from Netherlands, is about EFC 55 guideline. So the question is, are you aware of an update of the EFC 55 being available at the end of this year, and the world-class maintenance best practice in Netherlands on risk-based CUI management as per April? And if yes, do you consider these as a major step forward? So I'll like to add to that EFC 55 have been made available, and I think it's going on. And I can see one of the attendees for today is Gino, and he has been leading. He's been author of EFC 55, and at some point we will have him contribute his views. So EFC 55, it's also called the Green Book, and it's a CUI management guideline from the Europe, from EFC, European Federation of Corrosion, and that's been released. As far as I know, it's being scheduled to release in Eurocore, which is in September at this point. But I'll actually ask this question to Gino, if you can contribute here by text, Gino. I mean, when are you releasing it? Is it delayed or is it on schedule, EFC 55? So, Rebecca, on these kind of initiatives, what do you think? You know, there are different guidelines. Are they competing, or are they one step above the other, or they're kind of similar for specific regions? For example, for UK is a different, and European is a different, and globally, are these guidelines universal or specific? What do you think?
I think a lot of them are quite universal, because CUI isn't a specific problem to a specific region, and usually the management of it from a health and safety executive point of view, legislation is pretty much again quite standard across all the different sectors and locations. I do think some of the challenges are putting some of these guidelines into practice, and then also the case studies, because a lot of them are quite high level and it's a recommendation and it'll give you guidance on how to manage it. But not all of the companies that we work with have the ability or the resource to go through every part of that guideline to implement, because there are some other constraints associated with it. Could be the age of the plant, the types of, you know, the management structure, etc., and also the different contracting entities between the operator and the service providers. I think we've seen this with the non-intrusive inspection of pressure vessels. We've had similar feedback as well, that the guidelines are always great and they're welcomed by the community because it gives you food for thought. It's more about the practicality of actually putting it in place can be quite challenging. Right. And the understanding on how to do that. So some of the work that we've been doing, and again, you know, to some of the work that Hoist and that is to really understand the effectiveness of the techniques or the guidelines, that, you know, the recommendations, to say how do they work and how's the best way to do that. And I think that's where the case studies and a lot of, you know, and the publication of the results of any field trials will help the understanding. So I think there are a good guide to the industry and a good starting point, but I think we need to do more as an industry to share the learnings of how to implement it. What were the challenges? How did you overcome those challenges? And what are the best ways of implementing some of the techniques that are recommended? Okay, thank you.
The last few questions I'll take. Actually, this is more for the data-driven technique. So, how are the models being validated? How much confidence we can build in these models if it's predictive models? Femke, this is more to you. If as it is mentioned that it's okay to use data-driven techniques, but it's also trust factor, which you mentioned. How is the industry validating these models, and how can we build trust around these models? Over to you, Femke.
Yeah. Maybe 2 comments to make there. First, what we have seen over time is if you start working with more like advanced intelligence, big data analytics, etc., start also with more white box modeling, maybe some of the easier challenges, because you can deep dive directly into very complex type challenges and black box modeling, but then the trust factor is really difficult to get. So the first thing is start with the more simple questions, white box modeling, so that is more like giving the organization the trust factor. And my second answer, that's a bit more technical, that is more from your data science approach. What you typically do if you have a certain problem statement or whatever that you start to model, what you, for example, typically do is that you use the relevant data for actually to build your model and to train your model. But then what you always do is you keep some of the data actually apart. So once you have built the model and trained the model, you have then had an isolated set of data, which you can actually use to then prove the accuracy of your modeling. But that's a bit more from a data science perspective, how you actually do that.
Right. So I think the key point there is to build trust, and to have the end users being contributing to those models, and code development.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, code development is one of the key ways. So that, you know, predictive, the future is predictive. CUI can be managed in a predictive manner. It's a question of trust in the models, and I think we have to have co-development approach between the researchers, industries, and the operators. I think that's a good closing statement. So I think we are reaching at the tail end of our session today, and thank you for a very interesting discussion and questions from the audience. And we hope you take away at least one useful point from here, from the discussion today, and hope this changes the way you can make or support in your role. We all have an important role to play in the CUI community. So our next CUI over coffee, my coffee is over now, but you know, so next CUI over coffee will be within next 2 weeks, discussing another topic on the CUI with new guests, and feel free to share your feedback and thoughts over this series. You can always email us at webinars@corrosionradar.com. Stay safe and well, and speak to you soon. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Femke, for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
With pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye for now.